Right, hello, this is Sloth with part 11 of Xavier's guide. This is supposed to be part of part 10, but the editing going from game to my calculator, like it shrank the video size for some reason. So here I am doing it again. And I think the reason is going into landscape mode, right, was not the thing I did. I went into portrait mode on my calculator and then everything shrank after that. So sorry for the abrupt ending of the last video. So right now the question is it better to have 5 sources of 10% reduction, damage reduction, son of a bee sting. Okay, is it better to have 5 sources of 10% damage reduction or 50% damage reduction? Just as a question, right? So if you have 10% damage reduction, you have, well, after your first hit of damage reduction, you're at now 90%. You continue to multiply by 90% because you're asking the question, how much damage is left? You're not asking, how much damage did I mitigate? So you do this 5 times. And we get about 59%. So if you have 5 different sources of 10% damage reduction, you end up with an overall 59% damage left. Or in other words, if we add that to, if we turn this into a negative value and add it to 1, about a 41% damage that was prevented, okay, or mitigated. Now, of course, really quick math, if you had one source of 50% damage reduction, you mitigated 50% and you're left with 50%, right? So here we can see that having one large source of damage reduction is better when the percentages add up to equaling the same total percentage, right? 10 times 5 is 50, right? And 50 is 50. Some people may think that it results in the same or better damage reduction when it comes in many sources. The mathematics, however, is that since it's multiplicative in this game, that it will end up being smaller. And it's from every source in this game gives you, like, it's different, even if it's classified the same. For example, we've already went through, but if you have 20% damage reduction from your tarot and 20% damage reduction from your trait, it's not 40% damage reduction. It's 20% damage reduction multiplicative. Okay, so let's ask a different question, right? Let's ask, well, that was one large source, right? What about some other combinations, like 2 medium sources? Like how about 20%, 20%, and 10%? Well, after your first 20% reduction, that's 80%. Then you multiply by 0.8 again, and then by 0.9 for that 10% reduction. Well, 20 plus 20 plus 10 is 50, right? We had a little stronger damage reduction in the first 2 buffs, but we still ended up with a number higher than 0.5. So even upping the value of the percentages will still give us a value higher than 0.5. So really quickly, it's best to have a really strong damage buff, a damage reduction buff, and more strong sources equates to more overall damage mitigation. So if we go back to Xavier, right? Xavier, he's a character that will get rewarded not just for number of enemies increasing his attack, and for hitting more enemies with his AoE attacks. But also, with his Indomitable Spirit, he gets damage reduction that can go up to 40%. It's very hard to get 40% damage reduction in this game from one source. The only other exception that I can think of off the top of my head is something like Invulnerable, right? Invulnerable gives damage reduction for 3 turns, in addition to a lot of other buffs. It's the reason why it has a 5-turn cooldown. Pretty good. And it's a rank 11 skill on Mytha. I think the only other character that has it is Papal Guard has it. And it's a rank 7 skill for him. A reason why these characters are used for weapon trials in spots where they have to tank a lot of damage is because they have a lot of damage reduction and the sources they get it from are pretty good and significant. Now, those are defender units. Having Xavier be a breaker unit, and he's the only breaker unit in the game currently that has such high values of damage reduction. Now that's, I wouldn't say offset, but it's conditional on him having many enemies around him. So he's going to incur punishment. Now, just because he has 4 enemies around him, that does not necessarily mean that he got hit 4 times, right? So in this game, you can be body blocked by other units. You can be attacked by units that will be at a disadvantage. And you can also, with his Maso and his Preempt, kill units before they attack you. So if you position him in the right spot, yes, his passive triggers, but it's not enemies surrounding him by 1 tile, it's up to 2 tiles. So even a unit that is, you could position Xavier against a wall, right? Or a corner that ends up making 2 spaces around Xavier impossible for any unit to get to. On top of that, you can have a range of 2 tiles of enemies trying to hurt him, and he's reducing the damage by 40%. If you position Xavier in such a manner where his back is against the wall, right? He actually likes that because Maso and Preempt will turn that into front attacks. So he gets a 12% damage reduction on top of that from his Breaker passive. Then, if you have an ally that gave him a damage reduction buff, that usually comes in 20%, sometimes 30% damage reduction on top of that. And you can get him into really high levels of defense, which I'll cover in a different video. So that's a lot of damage reduction. And also in a different video, we'll talk about teammates and how, because he's in Fortitude, Magnus provides even more damage reduction through his leadership aura. We'll talk about that in a different video, right? We'll go over the math there. So going back to my calculator here, right? Xavier ends up having massive levels of damage reduction, right? So if we get him at 40% damage reduction, he's at 0.6. Okay. Then if we get a front attack, which is 12%, he's now at 52.8%. Then if we had a damage reduction buff on from his teammates, which is most likely the case, since there are teammates that can give him buffs before he dives in, and they usually last 2 or 3 turns, then he can have, let's say, a 20% damage reduction buff on him. Okay? So that's 42% damage that he'll be taking in that circumstance. Now, he went in and did a bunch of damage, didn't he? And in that scenario, there's a good chance that enemies that are attacking him are injured. Healers go last. So a lot of units haven't got the opportunity to be healed yet. And when you're injured, you do 20% less damage, which is effectively a 20% damage reduction for us. So now he's at 33.8% damage received. Right? When you think about it. And I said I'd do it in the next video, but we'll do it here since it's real quick. Magnus, if you're healthy, which Xavier will be before he gets hit even once, he has another 10% damage reduction. So now he's at 30% damage received. On a defender unit, you would think that's crazy, right? To have so much mitigation, right? Or actually typical, right? For a defender unit to have this level of mitigation. On a breaker unit, this is kind of almost busted in the right circumstance, in my opinion. Like that's a lot, and it's not that hard to conceptualize Xavier in this sort of scenario, right? When you have the right support from his teammates in conjunction with the right placement, it makes it hard for him to be taken down, right? He also has a breaker passive in which if he takes a ranged attack, he reduces that by 12%. So now he's at 26.8% damage reduction. What if you had if you got hit by magic damage, right? Isn't magic damage supposed to be the bane of a lot of units? What if all this damage reduction still equates to him taking 26.7% like damage, because most magic damage is ranged, right? And unless they can hit him from the side or the back, right, he will still get that 12% damage reduction when attacked from before, right, from the front. And even if you can still attack him from the side or the back, you just kind of go back one step, right? What's my history? History says he'll take 30.4%. So magic damage, he'll mitigate most of it and be left with 30.4%. There's gear and items that can allow for him to use that one veil trinket. Let's say it's at just level 1, right? Star level 1. Well, it reduces magic damage by 50% for one time. Now, he's taking 13.4%. But let's divide by 0.5 to get him back. And let's say you had a 5-star version of that. 3 instances of 0.7. Effectively rendering magic damage done to him kind of useless, right? Which is really great. Can you imagine in a PvP scenario where you have Xavier go in, he does a bunch of damage, right? He sets himself up with a high level of physical defense. He's still living. And then you're there thinking, it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to wipe him out with magic damage. Nothing lives through magic damage. And you happen to have that trinket that gives magic reduction, magic damage reduction, and they can't do anything, right? And that lasts for 2 turns. So they have to use their spells or their attacks to clear it, and your team's gonna arrive next round to help support Xavier, and by then he's done all he's done a lot in terms of a trade-off. Okay, well, I didn't want that to be extremely long, So it's been 15 minutes. All right. Thanks for watching.